Today we talk about a subject most of us don't ever want to have to talk about. And that is, when do you call it quits? When do you know it's just not going to happen? And when you need to move on? I'm Dr. Mark Amols, and this is Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday. I want to preface this podcast by making sure everyone understands that this is my opinion. I am a strong believer in never giving up, and I don't think anyone should ever give up. The purpose of this podcast is to talk about when the odds are so against you, is it really worth moving forward? And how do you know when those odds are against you? See, if you go by what most people say online, you would think, oh, if my AMH is low, I can't get pregnant. But that's not true. If your FSH is too high, I can't get pregnant. That's also not true. But there are times when the writing is on the wall. You can see from the IUI cycles or the IVF cycles that the chances are so low that at that point, you're just gambling. You're basically hoping that you get pregnant, but you understand, just like buying a lottery ticket, at this point, it's chance. And so today, I want to go through some of those scenarios and talk about that. There is never a point by how long you've been trying that should tell you should quit. So I don't care if you've been trying 10 years, 20 years, that doesn't matter. Because if you've been doing it wrong, right, you're not going to get pregnant. But time does matter when you are doing things that should be fixing it, and it's not. And so I get people coming all the time who've been trying for 10, 15 years, and they say to me that, well, they just didn't think it would ever happen, so they didn't try, and then finally they got insurance, and they just said, let's try it. And something very simple, and they got pregnant. And so when we talk about quitting, we're talking about people who have tried, and it's not working. And so one example would be if, let's say you were doing IVF and many people have a failed IVF cycle. It happens all the time. But the question comes up is it worth doing it again? I have this talk with my patients all the time. It's one of the hardest things I do. I have to explain to them why the IVF cycle didn't work. And then I know my recommendation is going to be whether they decide to do this again. And to me, that's a lot of pressure because I know that people have to spend money. I know people have to give their time. And again, all of this purely based off whether I think it's worthwhile doing again. Personally, I am very honest. I'm always going to tell a patient if their chances are good or not. But I also am much more of an optimistic person. I've had many doctors tell some of my patients they should give up where I would have never recommended that. So keep that in mind that I probably do encourage people to try more, but that's because I've been there. Not having a kid was something I didn't want to ever accept. And so I was willing to do anything to get to that point, and I understand that. So one of the things you have to look at is what your potential is and what's happening. Okay? If you are someone who is, let's say, young, and you're making few eggs, well, then you have to remember that you're making fewer eggs. You can't compare yourself to someone else who's young who's not getting pregnant because they make, let's say, 16, 20 eggs. But if you're only making 4 or 5, then in that situation, you have to realize that it would take you 4 cycles to equal that person's IVF cycle. And so that's one of those situations where I would not give up. Because you're getting the eggs, you're getting the embryos. Now, if you weren't getting embryos, which we'll get into in a minute, that may change it. But first, I just want to talk about numbers. So when you're young, and I say anyone under 35, I would consider young. At that point, as long as you're making 4 eggs, even up to 6, you're going to eventually get pregnant. It won't not happen because of number of eggs. Because really all you need is probably 12 at that age, and it can eventually work. But if you, let's say, are 38 and you're only getting, let's say, 2 eggs each time, that's going to become very difficult. Matter of fact, if you are even in your 40s and you're barely getting 4 eggs, it becomes more difficult, but not impossible. Again, I think it's very reasonable to try. I think the main thing you have to think about is that am I at least making the eggs? And then what happens to them? So when we talk about the next stop, what happens to them, that's the thing I always look at most. I don't care if someone makes 2 eggs. I don't care if they make 40 eggs. What I care about is what happened afterwards. Did they all fertilize? Did they all make it to the blastocyst and then they just didn't come back normal? Well, in that situation, that's just bad luck. But they did fantastic. They made the embryos grew all the way out. You can't do anything more. You can't make God make your embryos normal. On the same token, though, there are people who get lots of eggs. Some fertilize, and almost all of them die very early on, sometimes by the 3rd day, 2nd day. And then that's a different situation now, because then you have to look and go, okay, there clearly is something very difficult here. So you try it again. I always believe you have to at least try it twice, because you can't use one cycle and predict how you'll do in the future. But after that 2nd cycle, if the same thing happens again, and you've made adjustments to at least try to address it, at that point, you have to then ask yourself, what's your potential? And that's how it would affect my recommendation of whether you should go again. So if, let's say, you are 28 years old and you've gone through 2 IVF cycles, let's say if you got 20, 25 eggs each time, and the situation is you get lots of embryos, but they keep coming back abnormal, well, then at that point, again, that's chance. And that just comes down to, giving another try. But if the embryos aren't doing well, then I would recommend possibly even going to another clinic. Even if you're at my clinic, I'm never against that. I think if I'm not getting you pregnant, there's a point where even I have to say, listen, I don't know what it is about why we're not getting, we have a very good numbers, but maybe your body needs a different system, and I'm not against that. But let's say you do that, and the same thing happens again. So now you're seeing the same pattern at other clinics. At that point, then it comes down to how much energy do you have? Do you have enough energy to keep trying over and over? Or at that point, it's not unreasonable to say, okay, I've done my best. I've tried more than one place. I know it could be done, but now I'm basically gambling. And so that's a situation where I think it's not unreasonable to say, I'm going to stop, or at least do something different, such as donor eggs. Where I usually have this conversation is usually where I have people who are younger, like let's say 21, 22, who only make like 1 or 2 eggs, and everyone's told them they shouldn't try. And I'm actually telling them, no, you should try, because you only need like 2 eggs to get pregnant when you're that young. And so we do have to go through multiple cycles. Now, if we did multiple cycles, and then again, everything kept coming back genetically abnormal, then we get back to the prognosis. We know that she's never going to make more than 1 or 2 eggs. And if everything keeps coming back abnormal after we do testing, then at that point, again, that's a situation where it's not unreasonable to say, okay, even though I'm young enough for this to work, my potential is so low with only 1 egg I can get each month, and I'll have to keep doing this multiple times, and I don't know if I have the energy for that. If you do, fine. If you have the money for it, fine. But most of us don't. Most of us get burnt out. Even my wife and I, when we hit our late 40s and we were thinking about trying again, we really thought about it and said we were so blessed to have 2 pregnancies with all the difficulties that it just didn't make sense to try again. We didn't want to go through the heartache that we know you go through IVF. And so when you're thinking about, should I quit? I think the most important thing, absolute most, is definitely talk to your doctor. And if you don't agree with your doctor, get a second opinion. That's a fantastic option. A second opinion does not mean you have to leave your doctor. That's saying I want someone else's opinion that might have a different perspective. And that's always good. But what you need to look at is, what is your potential? If you're making lots of eggs and you have a high potential, even if something goes bad, you have the opportunity for something to go well. So I don't recommend quitting in those situations. I think it's always worth just trying again, or at least doing something different. But when you make too few eggs, and then on top of that, you're seeing poor egg quality, you're seeing poor embryos, there is a point where you have to ask yourself, am I content? And I can't make that decision for you. Only you can make that decision. But it's never wrong to say, I'm exhausted. I'm done. And I wouldn't never think of it as quitting. You're not quitting. You're saying, listen, it's not easy for me, and my realistic chances are not that high. And I'd rather take my time, my money into other things that will make me happy, maybe even donor eggs, versus just gambling. I wish I had a formula I could give you to tell you exactly when you should quit. That doesn't exist. But what I can tell you is that you have to look at your situation and you have to figure out, what's my potential? I use this analogy all the time. I tell people, I think of IVF like a marathon. In a marathon, it's 26.2 miles. If your friend went to go run a marathon, and 2 to 3 miles in the marathon, they fall down, they're just like, oh my God, I am so tired. I am so tired. And then they stop and they quit and they say to you, hey, should I try again? What are you going to say? Well, of course you want to be nice, but oh yeah, but really is no, you didn't even make it 10% of the way. It was horrible what you did. You might want to just give up. This is not for you. In the same token, you think of IVF like that. See, we think of IVF as outcomes. Did I get pregnant? Did I have a baby? But in reality, people can do amazing and still have bad results. People can do very poorly and have good results. I had people who come to me and we only got like 1 or 2 embryos and they got lucky and they got pregnant and they come back and I'm like, okay, let's make all these changes. And I'm like, why would we change it? Everything worked. I'm like, well, yeah, it worked, but it actually wasn't that good. And then we make changes and things go much better. And so you have to look at yourself and say, okay, what was my potential and did I reach it? If your potential is 4 eggs and you get 4 eggs every time and you get fertilization every time and you get embryos every time and it just doesn't work, then no, I'm more like, hey, let's keep trying. But if your potential is 10 eggs and you're getting 1 egg each time and your chances of the eggs being normal are only 10% versus, let's say, 60% for someone young, then that's the point where you have to go, wow, I'm not even getting close to my potential. If I'm not even getting close to what I potentially can do, then how am I ever going to get there when my statistics, even at my potential, are already low? So again, there's no formula. You have to look in your heart. You have to look at how hard this has been for you. But there is a time where you have to say, I'm done. And hopefully that doesn't ever come for some of you. I hope everyone has success. But sometimes even after you have success, you won't want to try again, like my wife and I. But the most important thing is always look at your potential. Did you meet your potential? And then also talk to your doctor. Talk to another doctor. But make sure you feel content, that you have closure. And if you do, then that's the right time to call it quits. I know this wasn't the happiest podcast, but I think it's important for people to at least understand, or at least have this conversation so you can then maybe have this conversation with your doctor and figure out what's best for you. I always appreciate everyone who listens to this. And I really appreciate when people tell me that they like the podcast and that it helps them, because I'm doing this, on the computer. I don't see anyone. I don't really have the traditional feedback. So I'm hoping it's helping people because that's my goal. Can't wait to talk to you guys again next week on Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.